The dump truck's bed came up on its hydraulics, and 40 tons of cracked cast iron went over the lip all at once. It didn't sound like a crash. It sounded like church bells falling down a staircase. A long, rolling, ringing avalanche of broken stove plates and split firebox doors and cast bodies, with hairline fractures running through them like veins in a leaf. Adelaide Cobb stood 20 feet back and watched it come down. 70 years old. Silver braid down the back of a charcoal wool coat. A brass case stove thermometer hanging at her collarbone on a bootlace, swinging once and going still. A chunk of a 1912 parlor stove skidded to a stop 8 inches from her boot. She didn't move. The driver climbed down, looked at the pile, looked at her, looked back at the pile. "Ma'am." He wiped his hands on his jeans. "You understand this is garbage. Nobody wants it. It's cracked, all of it. That's why it's $20 a ton." Then he waited. People always do. They want you to explain yourself, so they can decide whether to laugh right now or wait until they're back in the truck. Adelaide walked over to the pile, put her bare hand flat on a broken stove plate the size of a dinner tray, cold enough to burn. And she said one sentence to him. 6 words. That's all it was. And that man closed his invoice book and did not say another word. 3 weeks earlier, a propane salesman had sat at her kitchen table and told her, kindly, and he meant it kindly, "That's the part that matters. You don't have to be special out here, ma'am. You just have to be warm." By December, it was 70 degrees inside that house. Not 1 gallon of propane. And the whole hollow had stopped laughing. Adelaide Cobb came back to the hollow in November of 2024, and she had been gone 46 years. That's the number. 46. Long enough that the county had repaved the Ridge Road twice. Long enough that the feed store she remembered had burned down, been rebuilt, changed hands, and started selling propane fittings out of the same corner where her father used to buy nails. She drove up in a 14-year-old sedan, with everything she owned in the back seat, and one thing in the trunk she hadn't opened in 7 months. Sherwood's tackle box. Her husband, 41 years married, dead in April of a heart that quit in a grocery store parking lot in Ohio, between the automatic doors, and the car holding a paper bag with 4 oranges in it. The thing nobody tells you about being widowed at 69 is that the casseroles stop after 3 weeks. The phone calls stop after 2 months. And then it's just you. And a thermostat. And a house that costs exactly the same to heat whether one person lives in it or 2. Her daughter Verna lived in Portland and called on Sundays. Her son Wyatt lived in Charlotte and called when he remembered, which was less often than he meant to, and both of them said, "Let us know if you need anything in that particular voice that means please don't." She didn't blame them. She'd raised them to build their own lives, and they'd gone and done exactly that, which is the cruelest possible success. So Adelaide did what she had always done when the world stopped making sense. She got a pencil, and she did the arithmetic. 31 years a bookkeeper. A machine shop first. Then a lumber yard. Then 11 years at a regional trucking outfit, where she reconciled fuel receipts until her eyes went bad. She was good at it. Better than good. She could look at a column of numbers and hear when one of them was lying. And the column said, "Sell the house in Ohio. Pay the last of Sherwood's medical bills. And what's left over will not cover rent anywhere on God's earth that she would want to spend the rest of her life." Except there was one asset she'd never counted. 90 acres of Kentucky hollow. Steep, rocky, half of it in second-growth timber. A barn with a good roof. A house with a bad one. her father's place. She had been paying the property tax on it by mail for 30 years. Every October. A check and a stamp, and no return trip. She had not set foot on that land since the spring of 1978. And that ought to tell you something. Because a woman who is genuinely finished with a place lets it go to the county for back taxes and never thinks about it again. A woman who pays for 30 years is a woman keeping a door unlocked that she is too ashamed to walk through. The house was worse than she expected and better than she deserved. Bad roof over the back half. A water stain on the ceiling of the room she'd slept in as a girl, spreading out across the plaster like a continent nobody had discovered. Mice in the pantry. A wasp nest the size of a dinner plate under the porch eave, gone gray and papery and empty. But the bones held. Because Ephraim Cobb built the back half of that house himself in 1961, and the man did not build things that fell down. She stood in the kitchen the first night, with a flashlight, and her coat still buttoned, and turned in a slow circle. The counter. Same counter. The window over the sink, still with that ripple in the glass at the bottom left corner that used to turn the whole yard into water if you looked at it sideways. And the chair by the north window. That's where they found him. October of 1994. 79 years old, sitting in that chair, with a cold cup of coffee at his elbow, and a green cloth field journal on the sill, where he always kept it, rubber band still around the middle. Adelaide had gotten the call in Ohio on a Tuesday afternoon. She had not gone to the funeral. 30 years, and she never told a living soul why. Not Sherwood. Not her children. Not one human being. She stood there in the dark, with the flashlight beam shaking a little at the edges. Then she went out to the car, and got her suitcase. And she did not look at that chair again for 11 days. The first winter tried to kill her. Politely. That's how the mountains do it. They don't come at you screaming. They come at you as a bill. She had the propane tank filled in December, because there wasn't another option on the table. The furnace was 30 years old, and it groaned like something in pain when it kicked on, but it ran. She set the thermostat to 58. Closed the upstairs off entirely. Nailed quilts over 2 doorways. Slept in the front room, because the front room was closest to the vent. And by January, she was sleeping in her wool coat more nights than not. 58 degrees for 5 months. In a house her father built. And in March, the bill came. $2,340. She read it 4 times. Because that number was more than the farm could clear in a year. That number was rent on an apartment she didn't have. That number was, and Adelaide was always honest, with a column of figures. It was the one thing she was reliably honest about. That number was the eviction notice the mountains hand you every February, with a smile, and a fuel surcharge. She had savings. She counted them, that night in 20s, on the oilcloth, because there is something about counting money in your hands that a bank statement cannot do to you. $11,700. Minus the well pump she replaced in January. Minus the chimney man, who took one look at the flue, charged her $400, and told her not to light the parlor stove until she got the crown repointed. $6,800. That was the whole world. 70 years old. $6,800. And a heating bill that would take a third of it every single winter for whatever winter she had left. Do that math out loud sometime. In a cold kitchen. At 11 at night. With nobody in the house. That's what she did. And then she went looking for something to read. Because there was nothing else in that house worth reading. And because she would not have admitted this to anybody, she wanted to hear him talk. The journals were in a crate under the workbench in the barn. 11 of them. All green cloth. All rubber banded. all filled with that cramped, slanted handwriting. And the drawings. She carried them into the kitchen 2 at a time, because 11 at once was more than her back would allow any more, and that was its own small humiliation she did not dwell on. Set them on the table under the lamp. Slipped the first rubber band off, and it broke in her fingers. 30 years of dry. The neighbors used to have a word for those journals. They called Ephraim eccentric when they were being kind. And they were not often being kind. Old Ephraim with his diagrams. Old Ephraim with his notion that a fire ought to burn hot for 2 hours and then heat you for 2 days. Because that's what the sketches were. Page after page of them, going back to 1968. A masonry heat loop. A firebox feeding a channel of flue gas that ran horizontally through a mass of stone and brick before it ever reached the chimney, so the smoke gave up its heat to the mass instead of throwing it out the roof. Not a fireplace. A fireplace is a hole in your wall that steals warm air and sends it to the sky. This was the opposite of that. Adelaide turned the pages slowly. And she was a bookkeeper. So she did what bookkeepers do. She checked his math. Channel lengths. Bell chamber volumes. Mass required to hold 60 hours of heat for a 1,400 square foot house. She checked it with a pencil on the back of the propane bill, and her hand stopped. Because it was right? Not approximately right. Not close enough for a crank right. Right. The man everybody in 3 counties had laughed at for 40 years could calculate thermal mass to 2 decimal places at a kitchen table, with no education past the 10th grade. She sat back in the chair, and something happened in her chest that she did not have a name for, and did not want one. It took her 4 nights to hit the line. Volume 6. 1977. Halfway down a page about a hay barn that kept freezing. Cold is not an enemy. It's just heat that hasn't been stored yet. She read it twice. Then she read it out loud, once, to an empty kitchen, with her breath just barely visible in the lamplight. And it sounded exactly like him. That flat, unimpressed delivery he used when he thought you were making a simple thing complicated. That voice that never once in her entire childhood got raised, which, when she was a teenager, she had found absolutely unbearable. Because how do you fight with a man who won't raise his voice? She put the journal down, got up, went to the sink, ran the water, and didn't wash anything. 70 years old, standing at her dead father's sink at midnight, crying about a sentence. Get a hold of yourself, Adelaide. Except she couldn't, because that was the first time she had heard his voice since the spring she left. And it turned out she had been carrying the sound of it the entire time. Folded up small, shoved somewhere she didn't look. She kept reading. And on page 31 of volume 6, underlined twice in pencil, she found the place where he stopped. Masonry cracks under thermal cycling. Need mass that expands and doesn't split. Need iron. And then nothing. She turned the page. More sketches. A completely different subject. A gate latch. She flipped forward, through 3 more volumes looking for where he picked it back up. He never picked it back up. 40 years of drawings. And the whole thing died on the word iron. Adelaide sat with that a long time. Because iron costs money. And Ephraim Cobb never had any. Ridley Marsh came up the road on a Tuesday in April, and Adelaide heard the truck before she saw it. She was on the porch, with a cup of coffee and a pencil, working through volume 4. The truck was new. Company decal on the door. And the man who got out of it was maybe 50. Sandy hair combed over and held with product. Navy quilted vest. Pale blue Oxford. Khakis with a crease you could shave with. And ox blood dress shoes. which picked up 2 inches of Kentucky mud on the walk, from the truck to the porch. He looked down at them twice, with the expression of a man who has been personally insulted by weather. He had an aluminum clipboard under one arm. "Mrs. Cobb? Cobb is right. Ridley Marsh. Hand out. I service this whole side of the county." She shook it. Didn't get up. He waited to be invited in. She let him wait. Then she got up and opened the door, because her mother had raised her, and you do not leave a man standing on a porch, even when every instinct you have says you should. He didn't ask to sit. He just sat. And the aluminum clipboard came down on her kitchen table, with a little metallic clack, decal facing her like a business card the size of a cutting board. "I'm going to make your life easy," he said. Tap. Tap. Pen against the clipboard rim. $89 a month. That was the number. A leased propane furnace. Forced air, 92,000 BTU. Installed free. Free. He said it twice. New tank on a concrete pad out by the smokehouse. First fill included. No money down. Thermostat on the wall. Set it and forget it. He slid a carbon copy form across the table and set the pen on top of it, angled toward her hand. The way they teach you in the training seminar. Adelaide stood at the counter. She did not move toward the pen. So he kept going. Because men like Marsh fill a silence the way water fills a hole. "I knew your daddy," he said. "Well, knew of him. My father had this route before me." Something small moved behind Adelaide's eyes and did not reach her face. "Good old fella, from what I hear. Stubborn as a stump." He was. And look. I get it. He gestured at the parlor stove behind her. At the wood box. At the scuttle. Sentimental value. The whole thing. But that's a museum piece, hon. He said hon the way you'd hand somebody a coat. You're 70 years old. You're out here by yourself. You're gonna spend 120 nights a year feeding a fire like it's 1910. For what? Pride? The pen tapped. Pride doesn't heat a house. Pride doesn't keep the pipes from splitting. She said nothing. Her cheekbones had gone pink, which in that cold kitchen meant absolutely nothing at all. He took it for embarrassment. "I'll be honest with you," he said, warming to it, "because nobody else in this county will." He leaned forward. "Your daddy died owing the co-op $400. He left you 90 acres of rock and a barn full of scrap iron. That's the inheritance. That's the whole thing. Now, I can't fix 90 acres." He leaned back and let the dimples come out on schedule. "But I can fix cold." And then he said it. 89 a month. Same as everybody else. You don't have to be special out here, Mrs. Cobb. You just have to be warm. You don't have to be special out here. He said it like a kindness. It was the meanest sentence spoken in that kitchen all winter. And here's what you need to understand about Ridley Marsh. Hold on to it, because it matters at the end. He meant it kindly. He genuinely, sincerely believed that he was doing an old woman a favor. That's worse. That is so much worse than cruelty. Cruelty you can push against. Cruelty has a shape and a handle. But a man who pities you while he is cutting you off at the knees, there is nowhere to put your hands. Then he added the part he'd been saving, tapping the form. "And if the money's an issue, and there's no shame in that, none at all, we've got a senior hardship program. 99 a month, 36 months. And I write it up as a courtesy." He smiled. "Nobody has to know." Nobody has to know. As if being broke were something she had been caught doing. Adelaide walked over, picked up his pen, set it down on his side of the table. Then she picked up the form, folded it once, and held it out to him until he took it back. "No," she said. That was the entire answer. One syllable. Plain as a shut door. He waited for the rest. The apology. The explanation. The nervous little laugh that lets a salesman keep his footing. It didn't come. She just stood there and let the quiet get uncomfortable for exactly as long as it needed to be. He gathered up the clipboard, smiled without the dimples this time. "You'll call me in February," he said on his way out, and left a boot print on her porch boards and spun his tires once in the mud before they caught. He was wrong about February. He would be wrong about a great many things for years, at the top of his voice. That night she couldn't settle. So she did what she had done every time she couldn't settle, since she was 9 years old, which was to organize something. She started with the drawers in her father's bedroom, which she had not opened. Socks. Handkerchiefs, ironed, which nearly took her out at the knees. A pocket watch with no crystal. 3 pencil stubs and a folding rule. And in the bottom drawer, under a wool blanket that smelled like cedar, and 1980, a manila envelope gone soft as cloth at the corners. She opened it at the kitchen table. Tax receipts, a well permit, a seed catalog order from 1969, and a contract. 4 pages. Carbon copy. Gone amber at the edges. Residential propane service agreement, 48 months. Dated the 11th of January, 1971. And on the last line, in that cramped, slanted hand she had been reading for 4 nights straight, Ephraim Cobb. Adelaide sat very still, because her father had signed. Her father. The crank. The stubborn old man. The one who was supposed to have died on principle in a cold house, with a stack of green oak. Her father had signed the exact contract she had just refused. 48 months. She turned the page. Payment schedule. $22 a month in 1971 money, which was not nothing. Which was, when you ran it against what a hollow farm cleared in a year back then, an enormous amount of something. And her hands had started to shake, and she didn't know why yet. Why? Why would he? She went and got volume 3 off the stack. Flipped to January of 1971. Here is what her father wrote that month. In pencil. In a hand that pressed harder than usual. Addie's fever back up. Doc Renard came out in the snow, would not take money. Both lungs. House will not hold above 44, with the stove going all night. She shakes so hard the bed frame knocks the wall. Cannot do this again. And 2 pages later, on the 12th of January. Signed with the gas company. 48 mo. That is the iron money. Adelaide put her hand flat on the table. That is the iron money. 16 years old. Pneumonia. February of 1971. She remembered it the way you remember being 16 and sick. Badly. In pieces. Mostly the ceiling. She remembered waking up one night, and the room being warm. Genuinely warm. Not blanket warm. Room warm. She remembered thinking it was the fever. And she had never once, in 54 years, asked how. He had been saving for the iron since 1968. She could see it. It was all right there in the ledger pages at the back of volume 2, because Ephraim kept his money the way he kept everything. In a column. NOV 68, 11. 00 Dec 68, 6. 00 February 69, 14. 50 May 69, 22. 00. 3 years of it. Dollar by dollar. Timber sold. A calf sold. A fence job done for a neighbor, over 4 Saturdays. $491 by the end of 1970. And then a line in January of 1971 that just said, 0. He spit it on a tank of gas and a payment book so his daughter could breathe. And he never started the column again. She checked. She went through all 11 volumes that night looking for a second column, and there was no second column. Ever. The man traded 40 years of his life's work for one warm winter. For her. And she had spent 46 years thinking he was a fool. Adelaide Cobb did not sleep that night. She sat at that kitchen table until the window over the sink went gray, and somewhere around 4 in the morning she said something out loud. She said, "I'm sorry," to nobody. In an empty house. Which is the worst possible time to say it. 30 years late, to a chair by a north window. You didn't go to the funeral. Don't. You got the call on a Tuesday, and you told Sherwood the drive was too far. And it was not too far, it was 6 hours. You drove 6 hours to a craft fair in Berea in 1989, and you know it don't. She got up, washed her face in cold water. And by the time the sun came over the East Ridge, she had stopped crying and started doing arithmetic, which is the only prayer she had ever been any good at. Here's what she understood, sitting there with the pencil. Iron is fast. Cast iron is a conductor. Heat runs through it like current through copper. Load a stove with dry oak, get it roaring, and the plate is throwing heat into the room in 8 minutes. Feels like a miracle. Then the fire dies. And 40 minutes later the room is cold again. Because iron holds almost nothing. It's a pipe, not a barrel. It moves heat. It does not keep it. Masonry is the opposite. Fire brick, soapstone, clay. Slow to take heat, slow to give it up. A brick core will absorb a fire's energy for 2 hours, and then release it for 10. Her father's entire obsession, the thing that got him laughed out of the co-op in 1968, was the marriage of the two. Iron on the outside for the fast lift. Mass on the inside for the long hold. A stove that warms you in 10 minutes, and is still warm at 4 in the morning. He never got it to work. That's the part the neighbors always left out, when they told the story of the old man and his crazy stoves. He never got it to work, because he never got the iron. There was a scrap yard down in Bristol. Adelaide found it the way you find anything out here. You ask one person, who tells 2 people, who tell a man at a counter. 19 years of accumulation. Cast iron pulled out of demolished houses across 4 counties. Parlor stoves and cook ranges, and box heaters, hauled out of places that went all electric in the 60s. Stacked in rows under tarps, and going orange. Because no scrap buyer would take cast at a decent rate. And no antique dealer would touch anything with a crack in it. She drove down on a Thursday. Walked the rows for 2 hours in the charcoal wool coat, with her hands behind her back, like a woman at a museum. She had a ball-peen hammer in her purse. Which is a sentence that should tell you everything you need to know about Adelaide Cobb. She'd tap a plate and listen. Tap. Listen. Move on. Good iron rings. Cracked iron thuds. Her father taught her that when she was 6 years old, tapping the side of the kitchen range with a spoon and telling her to listen for the difference between a note and a nothing. 54 years since she'd thought about it. Her hand remembered anyway. The yardman watched her from the office window for the first hour and came out at the start of the second. "Help you? How much for the whole row?" He laughed. Then he saw her face and stopped. "The whole row." 12 rows, Adelaide said. "If you can haul it." 40 tons. $800 at 20 a ton. And $1,100 more for 4 truckloads of hauling up a ridge road that a loaded flatbed had no business on. $1,900. 28% of everything she owned in the world. Spit on metal that 4 counties worth of scrap in had already agreed was worthless. She wrote the check standing up on the hood of her car, with the wind coming across the yard hard enough to lift the corner of the paper. The yard man looked at it a second longer than he needed to. "Ma'am, can I ask what you're doing with it?" And Adelaide Cobb gave him the only complete explanation she would give anybody for the next 3 years. "My father needed 40 tons of iron," she said, "and he never got it." She capped the pen. "He's getting it now." The trucks came the second week of May, and the sound of 40 tons of cracked cast iron going over a tailgate is not something you forget. It is church bells falling down a staircase, and it went up that hollow and came back off the far ridge 2 full seconds later, and every dog within a mile lost its mind. The driver climbed down, looked at the pile, looked at her, looked back at the pile. "Ma'am, you understand this is garbage. Nobody wants it. It's cracked, all of it. That's why it's $20 a ton." Adelaide put her bare hand flat on a broken stove plate the size of a dinner tray, cold enough to burn. 200 pounds of iron that would hold heat for 11 hours once it was warm. And this man, with his invoice book, saw a fracture line and a disposal problem. "Cracked iron still weighs the same," she said. He opened his mouth, closed it, wrote something on his clipboard that wasn't a word. Then he drove off, and the gravel didn't have the decency to be dramatic about it. It just crunched. News in that county moved through the feed store the way heat moves through iron. Slow, even, and it warmed everything it touched. By Thursday the whole counter knew that the Cobb woman had turned down free installation. By Friday the story had legs. She'd thrown him out. She'd cussed at him. She was going to burn that place down with a 100-year-old stove and a stack of green oak. Verna Teague put it plainest, because Verna Teague put everything plainest. Stocky, brown insulated coveralls, green plaid, a red knit cap balled up in her fist, because she'd pulled it off coming through the door. 41 head of Holsteins, and a mouth on her. $89, Verna said to the room, loud enough to carry. Woman turned down $89 a month to freeze on principle. At 70, somebody said something about the apple and the tree. Ephraim taught her to be poor, Verna said, and she took to it like a duck. Laughter. Not cruel, exactly. Worse than cruel. Comfortable. Adelaide was 4 feet away buying a box of stove bolts. She paid, took her receipt, walked out, didn't turn her head, didn't give them the satisfaction of a flinch. There is a kind of silence that reads as defeat, and there is a kind that reads as a woman doing arithmetic in her head. By the time the door swung shut behind her, 1 or 2 of them had started to wonder which one they'd just watched. She unloaded 40 tons by hand over 9 days. 70 years old. A hand truck, a plank ramp, and a canvas sling she rigged out of a hay strap. Some of it she could roll. Some of it she could lever with a pry bar. Some of it she moved 18 inches at a time, and then sat down on an overturned bucket for 4 minutes, and did not think of that as resting. She thought of it as waiting for the next part. Her hands split at the knuckles by day 3. Her back seized on day 5, and she lay flat on the barn floor on a moving blanket for 20 minutes, looking up at the rafters. And there was a genuine moment in there. She would tell you about it if you asked her directly, which nobody ever did. A genuine moment where she thought, nobody would find me until Sunday. She got up. She wrote it in the journal that night. Not the fear. The number. Day 5. 2. 1 tons moved. Back went at 3 p.m., down 20 minutes. Note. Sling under the firebox, not the flange. Flange breaks. because that is what her father had done for 40 years. He wrote down what broke, and she was beginning to understand something about those green cloth books. A journal is not a diary. A journal is a message. By the end of May, the barn floor was gone. Not swept. Buried. 206 cast iron stoves taken apart down to the last plate, bolt, and grate. Laid out in rows on cardboard and old feed sacks. She sorted them by sound. Grade A along the north wall, plates with no cracks, castings that rang like a bell. Grade B in the middle, cracked but pinnable. Warped but flattenable. Grade C by the doors, junk iron, good for nothing but patches and stove legs and melting weight. She chalked the letters right onto the concrete. And on the 29th of May, at 10 o'clock at night, she stood in the barn doorway, with a work light behind her, and looked at 400 separate pieces of dead iron laid out in the dark like an archaeology dig. The brass thermometer hung cold against her flannel. And she said, out loud, to a barn full of garbage, "All right, Daddy. Let's see if you were right." Ridley Marsh drove past the end of her lane in June. Slowed down. Looked at that barn for a long moment. Then he laughed. Alone. In his truck. Which is a strange thing for a man to do. And he made a note on the aluminum clipboard on the passenger seat. The note said, Cobb, F/U February. Because he was certain. He had 390 accounts in that county, and he had watched this exact thing a dozen times, and it always went the same way, and it always ended with a phone call in February. He would be dead wrong. But not for 2 more years. And not before he took something from her first. The first stove she rebuilt was a parlor unit out of a farmhouse near Blackie, and under the rust it was a beautiful thing. Nickel rail. Mica window. And an 11-inch hairline crack running clean across the top plate, where somebody had thrown a bucket of water on it, while it was hot. That's how most of them die. Not where. Panic. Adelaide learned stitch pinning out of a 1948 foundry manual she found in a box lot at an estate sale for $2. Here's what it is. You drill a series of holes across the fracture. You tap threads into each one. You screw in soft iron plugs, snap them off flush, and file them down until the whole line is a row of interlocking pins, and the iron is holding hands with itself across the wound. 22 pins in 11 inches. It took her 4 days. She broke 3 taps doing it, because cast iron eats tooling if you rush the feed. And Adelaide Cobb at 70 had a great many virtues, but patience with a hand drill was still under construction. The 3rd tap snapped, and she said a word she had not said since 1983. Then she wrote in the journal, "Feed slower. Iron doesn't care that you're in a hurry." Then, underneath, smaller, "Nobody is in a hurry. There is nobody waiting on this." Then she scratched that line out. But you could still read it. She mixed her own furnace cement. Not the tube stuff from the hardware store. Fire clay, sodium silicate, and a fine sand she screened through window mesh. Troweled into every joint where the plates met. Wired the whole body together. Left it a week in the cold barn to cure, with a work lamp underneath. Lined the firebox with split fire brick, half thickness, set on a bed of the same clay. And when it was assembled she stood back, and did not smile. She tested it. The muslin strip. Old chimney sweep's trick, and it is still the fastest draft test on earth. She tore a strip of muslin 2 inches wide. Held it at the open firebox door. Watched. If the cloth pulls inward, steady and flat, the flue is drawing. If it hangs limp, you have no draft. If it kicks out at you, your chimney is a decoration. The cloth pulled in. Good and even. First firing, she went easy. Paper and pencil kindling. Slow climb. Thermometer reading 180 at the plate. Second firing the next day. Small splits of ash. Up to 340. Both clean. Both quiet. The mica window glowed orange, and the barn actually got warm, and Adelaide sat on an overturned bucket, with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. And for about 6 hours, she let herself believe she had solved the problem her father chewed on for 20 years. 6 hours. Have you ever been that certain? Right before the floor gave out? Third firing, she loaded it properly. Full box of seasoned oak. Damper wide. Because she wanted to know what it would do at working temperature. What a real customer on a real January night would do with it. It smoked back first. A gray roll of it came out the door seam, and hung under the rafters stinking of creosote, and she got the damper adjusted, and the door shut, and thought she'd caught it in time. The thermometer went past 600. And then it made a sound she had never heard before and has not forgotten since. Not a bang. A tick. Sharp and small. Like a rifle bolt dropping in another room. The top plate split straight across. Not through her pins. 8 inches beside them. Following a line she hadn't drilled and hadn't seen. A stress line that had been sitting in that casting since a foundry in Ohio poured it in 1897. She let the fire die on its own. Stood there in the cold, with her arms crossed, and read the failure the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Because she already knew what she'd done wrong, before the iron stopped ticking. Too fast. She had taken it, from a cold barn to 600 degrees in 22 minutes. And cast iron expands about 7/1000ths of an inch per foot per 100 degrees. And there was nothing inside that stove to slow the climb. No buffer. No mass. Fire brick on the walls, sure, but the top plate had nothing behind it but air. And air doesn't share. Thermal shock. The iron hadn't failed her. She had failed the iron. The plate lay on the workbench, still warm enough to sting, and she ran a finger down the fracture like she was reading a sentence. 4 days of drilling. 4 days. 22 pins. And it broke somewhere I never touched. Which means no. Which means the pins were never the problem, they were never going to be the problem, and I have been solving the wrong thing for 4 days. She went and got the Greenfield Journal, slipped the rubber band off, and went hunting, through her father's handwriting, until she found a page he had started and never finished. A sketch of a firebox wrapped in a second skin, and under it, in that cramped pencil, "The fire is not the point. The fire is only the delivery." That was the whole thing. She had been building stoves. He had been trying to build batteries. So she started over. And the new design was absurd on paper. Every restored firebox would get jacketed. A shell of firebrick laid tight against the iron. Then a skin of soapstone slabs, cut and pinned around that. Then a channel of packed sand between the layers, so the whole assembly could swell and shrink without tearing itself apart. 900 pounds of mass. Around a stove that weighed 300. The math was cruel. 900 pounds meant a reinforced floor under every unit, which meant a hand truck, and a plank ramp, and a woman who weighed 138 pounds doing all of it alone at 70. She did it anyway. Here is what that actually looked like, and I want you to see it properly. Because the version where a woman simply decides to be strong is a lie people tell in movies. She could not lift a soapstone slab. So she didn't lift it. She walked it, corner over corner, tipping it end to end across the barn floor like moving a refrigerator. 8 inches at a time. 40 minutes for 12 feet. She could not hold a slab and mark a cut line at the same time. So she built a jig out of 2x4s, an AC clamp, and she took her time. Her wrists went bad in October. Both of them the same week. A burning ache that woke her at 3 in the morning and made her cry, from surprise more than from pain. She wrapped them in an elastic bandage and kept going. Her knees she simply stopped negotiating with. And on the 14th of November she dropped a 30-pound piece of firebrick on her left foot and sat down on the barn floor with her back against the wall and laughed. Just laughed. Out loud. Alone. In a freezing barn. Because what else is there? At 70. With a broken toe and a dead husband and 2 children who call on Sundays. And 900 pounds of rock you have to move by yourself before the snow comes. You laugh. Or you go inside. She taped the toe to the one next to it and went back out after supper. Ridley Marsh found her mid-November. Of course he did. He always turned up when the ground was soft enough to ruin those ox-blood shoes. And he never once learned to expect it. He stood at the edge of the shop, with the clipboard against his hip, counted the rows with his pen. 9, he said. 9 in 6 months. He whistled low. You know what I do in 6 months, Mrs. Cobb? Installs. 80, 90 of 'em. She set another slab on the bench and marked her cut line. See, that's the difference between a business and a hobby. He said it warmly. He meant it warmly. There's no shame in being small. There's shame in pretending you're not. Set the square. Mark the line. Don't look up. You're limping, he said. I am. Doing what? Dropped a brick. He shook his head slowly. The way you do at a child on a bicycle who's about to learn something. Ma'am, my mother's 72 years old. If I found her out in a barn in November, with a broken foot, moving rock, he stopped himself, softened it. I'd want somebody to say something. That's all this is. And she believed him. That was the miserable part. She looked at him standing there in the mud in his ruined shoes, with his aluminum clipboard, and she understood completely that Ridley Marsh believed he was the only person in 3 counties who cared whether she froze. Thank you, Adelaide said. He blinked. You are welcome for the concern. So you'll think about the... No. Ping. Pong. Done. He left another boot print on the porch. That winter she lived in one room. Sealed the rest of the house off with plastic sheeting and quilts nailed over the door frames. Because heating 4 rooms she wasn't using was money she did not have. 41 degrees in the mornings. She measured it. Because she measured everything now. Boiled water on a hot plate for coffee and for washing. Slept in the wool coat more nights than not. Her fair skin went red across the cheekbones in November, and stayed that way until March. Have you ever spent a winter deliberately cold, on purpose, because being warm would have meant admitting the thing you were building didn't work yet? Verna called on a Sunday in December. Mom, it sounds cold in there. It's fine. You sound like you're outside. I'm in the kitchen. A pause on the line. Long distance, and full of things neither of them was going to say. Wyatt says you didn't call him back. I'll call him. Mom. A breath. Are you okay out there? By yourself? And Adelaide Cobb, 70 years old, in a wool coat, in a 41-degree kitchen, with a broken toe, and 900 pounds of soapstone in the barn, said, I'm working on something. Which was the truest sentence she had spoken in 6 months. And her daughter said, Okay, Mom, in the voice adult children use when they have decided not to fight about it. And they talked about Portland for 11 minutes. And then it was quiet again. She put up a board. 4 feet of slate salvaged out of a torn-down schoolhouse, mounted on the shop wall. Every firing got chalked on it. Date. What species? Moisture content off the pin meter. Load weight in pounds. Then the readings, box temperature at ignition at 1 hour, and then jacket surface temperature every hour after. Straight through the night. Which meant she got up every hour. All night. All winter. At 70 years old. Set the kitchen timer. Sleep 50 minutes. Coat on, boots on, out across the yard in the dark. Read the stone. Chalk the number. Coat off, boots off, back to bed. 50 minutes. Again. 11 times a night. 90-some nights that winter. There is not a word in English for that kind of stubbornness that isn't also faintly insulting. I have looked. The first jacketed unit disappointed her badly. 18 pounds of seasoned white oak. Burned down hot. Air sealed. And by hour 4 the stone had dropped from 190 to 128. She chalked it. Stood back. Looked at the column until she saw it. The sand channel. She had packed it damp. The moisture had cooked out and left voids. And voids are air. And air is a highway for heat to escape. She tore it out. Rebuilt it with kiln-dried sand tamped in 3-inch lifts. The second unit smoked back into the room on ignition, which meant the flue was fighting the mass. A cold 900-pound jacket steals so much heat from the first 10 minutes of fire that the chimney never establishes draft. She solved that with a bypass damper. A small door that lets the first burn go straight up the flue and only routes the gases through the mass channel once things are roaring. She held the muslin at the firebox opening and watched it lean inward, steady, like a hand pulling it. The third unit cracked a soapstone slab. Because she had pinned it too rigid. She reset the pins and slotted holes, with a 1/4 inch of play. Stone moves. Let it. Every failure narrowed it. That's the part nobody tells you about building anything real. It isn't inspiration. It's subtraction. One wrong idea removed at a time, until only the working one is left standing. January the 9th, 2027. 31 pounds of hickory and white oak mixed. Moisture at 14%. Loaded at 6:40 in the evening. Bypass open 11 minutes, then closed. She let it burn down to coals by 9, and shut the air to a crack. Then she sat. And she got up. And she read. And she chalked. Hour 4, 168. Hour 6, 158. Hour 8, 149. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, she fell asleep at the bench, with her cheek on her folded arm, which she had not meant to do, and had not done in a year and a half. She woke at 5:40 in the morning to a room she did not recognize. Because it was warm. She lifted the brass thermometer off the stone. 140 degrees. 11 hours after the last flame died. On the barn wall, chalked in her own hand, the heat log ran down in a column. 9 p.m., 140. Midnight, 138. 2 a.m., 133. 6 a.m., 121. 8 a.m., 114. 11 straight hours of usable heat out of a firebox that had not seen a stick of wood since sundown. Adelaide stood in front of that board and did not feel triumph. She felt stupid. Not the bad kind. The good kind. The kind you feel when a thing you have been staring at for 2 years finally rotates 1 notch and shows you its other face. Because here is what those numbers actually said. The stove was not heating the barn. The stove had stopped burning at 9 o'clock. The barn was warm at 8 in the morning, because 600 pounds of iron and firebrick had held what the fire gave it, and let it go slow. The fire was the deposit. The iron was the account. 31 years I balanced other people's books. And I have been looking at a balance sheet this entire time, and calling it a stove. The stoves weren't heaters. The stoves were batteries. And once you say that word out loud, standing in a cold barn in eastern Kentucky, with your breath hanging in front of you, the next question arrives all by itself. And it will not leave. If iron holds heat, what else does? She went out and stood in the pasture. Frost on the grass. Sky the color of a dirty nickel. The ground ringing hard under her boots. And underneath those boots was dirt. Millions of pounds of it. Clay and shale, and old creek gravel, going down further than she had ever dug. And it was, at that exact moment, considerably warmer than the air she was breathing. Her father had a line about that. She found it 2 nights later. Page 40 of the 4th Green Journal. Cellar don't freeze. Never has. Ground's got a memory. The air don't. He'd meant potatoes. He'd meant a root cellar holding at 50-some degrees, through a February that killed the pump line. He never took it past potatoes. He ran out of years before he could. She was going to take it past potatoes. Here's the physics, and it is not complicated. It has just been sitting there and used since the first person dug a hole. Air temperature swings. 95 in August. 4 below in January. 100 degrees of variation in 12 months. Soil doesn't do that. The first foot down follows the air pretty closely. 3 feet down, the swing is cut in half, and it lags the season by weeks. Get to 6 feet, and the ground has essentially stopped listening to the weather. At 6 feet in, that part of Kentucky, the earth sits at 54 degrees. In January. In July. Same number. Forever. 54 degrees is a lot of things. But the most important thing it is stable. And stable is what a battery needs. You do not want a reservoir that changes its mind. So she got a shovel. That is not a figure of speech. She started the trench with a long-handled spade and a mattock on the first Tuesday of November. Alone. In the charcoal wool coat with the soot-gray knees. And she got 11 feet done the first day before her hands quit. Loose strands of silver hair stuck to her temples in 28-degree air. 11 feet. The loop she had drawn on butcher paper was 400 feet long. 11 feet a day. 400 feet. That's no. Don't do that number. Do not do that number, Adelaide. She did the number. 36 days. If nothing rained. If nothing froze. If her hands did not quit permanently. She sat down on the edge of her own 11-foot ditch and looked at it for a while. Then she went in and made supper. Verna Teague loaned her the backhoe in the second week, and nobody on earth was more surprised than Adelaide. Verna drove it over on a Sunday morning, left the key in it, stood there in the brown coveralls, with the red cap in her fist, looking at the trench line staked out across 90 feet of hillside. She did not ask a single question. "Diesel's on you," Verna said, and walked home. 2 miles. That's how apologies work out here. Nobody says the word. They just show up, with a machine and a rule about diesel. That backhoe cut 400 feet of trench, 6 feet deep, in 9 days. And Adelaide hand finished the bottom of every single foot of it. Because a machine bucket leaves a ragged floor. And you cannot lay pipe on ragged. Ridley Marsh came out during week 2. Of course he did. Polished ox blood shoes at the lip of a mud trench. Clipboard under one arm. "Digging a grave for it?" He smiled. "Because that's what this is. You know that." Adelaide pulled the next length of pipe off the stack. "My company services 390 accounts in this county," he said. "And not one of them is a woman burying pipe in a field because her daddy scribbled something about potatoes." She kept working. "Nobody's coming to save you, ma'am. You're not clever. You're just poor and stubborn. Pipe! Onto the bed of sand. Straighten it. And those two things look exactly the same, he said, right up until the bank explains the difference. He said it standing on ground that was 6 feet under his shoes, a perfectly comfortable 54 degrees. Adelaide straightened up. Mr. Marsh. Ma'am. Move your foot. He looked down, stepped back off the sand, and that was the entire conversation. What went into that trench was one continuous run of black polyethylene, 1.25 inches, laid in a slinky coil, so 400 feet of trench swallowed closer to 800 feet of pipe. Backfilled with screened sand first. Sand grips the pipe and passes heat. Air gaps don't. Then clay on top of that, tamped in 6-inch lifts. Both ends of the loop rose up out of the ground and ran into the barn. And in the barn, they met the iron. This is the part the county could not get through its skull. She was not heating the barn with the ground. She was doing the opposite. The stove mass units burned scrap slab wood and threw off far more heat than that barn could use in the hours the fire actually ran. All that surplus used to go up the flue as waste. Now a copper coil wrapped in the mass jacket took the surplus into water. And a small circulator pushed that water down into 800 feet of pipe 6 feet under the pasture, where it dumped heat into cold clay and came back cooler to get charged again. She was charging the ground, storing December in the dirt. On the 9th day of January she climbed down into the last open section of trench with a soil thermometer. 71 years old, going down a ladder into a 6-foot cut in the middle of a Kentucky winter, which is exactly as bad an idea as it sounds. She knelt in the wet cut, pressed her bare palm flat against the wall of earth. 54 degrees. 54 degrees in the dead middle of January, 6 feet down, under a field that everybody in that county had walked across their entire lives, without once wondering what it was holding. She stayed down there longer than she needed to. That number should have carried her all the way to spring. It carried her 11 days. Because Ridley Marsh came back on the 20th. And this time, he wasn't smiling. He didn't have a clipboard. He had an envelope. "I want you to know I didn't do this," he said. Which is the sentence a man says immediately, before you find out that he did it. The envelope was from the county. Building and codes. Notice of stop work, unpermitted mechanical installation. Adelaide read it twice. "I have permits on the trench. For a water line." "It is a water line." "It's a heating system, ma'am." He shifted his weight. "And a heating system has to be listed. Tested. Some lab in some state has to have put a sticker on it. Yours doesn't have a sticker. Yours doesn't have a category. So it's illegal. It's not anything," he said. "That's the problem. It doesn't exist. And you cannot install a thing that doesn't exist in somebody else's house." Somebody else's house. And Adelaide understood all at once exactly how much trouble she was in. Because 2 weeks earlier she had taken her first paying job. A man named Hollis Pruitt out on the county road with a workshop he couldn't afford to heat. For $100 for brick and iron. She had shaken his hand on it. She had the check in a drawer, uncashed, because she never cashed a check until the work was done. "You called the county on me," she said. "I reported an unpermitted install." He said it evenly. "That's my job. I hold a license. If I know about it and I sit on it, that's my license." And here is what makes this the worst moment in the whole story. He was telling the truth. He was absolutely, technically, procedurally correct. That's how the world takes things away from you. Not with villains. With paperwork. held by a man who is right. Hollis Pruitt called that same afternoon. The conversation lasted 40 seconds. Adelaide, I'm real sorry. Don't be. I can't have the county on me. I got a mortgage. I know it. If it was just me. Hollis. She closed her eyes. It's fine. I'll bring your check by Thursday. She hung up. Stood in the kitchen, with her hand still on the phone. Fine. That's fine. That is one customer. One. Except there were 4 more behind him. And every one of them will hear about it by supper, because this is a county where the milk truck carries news faster than the phone line. And by Friday, there will not be a soul in 3 counties who will let me touch their house. Which means the only thing on this earth I am legally permitted to heat is my own barn. She got the checkbook out and drove Hollis Pruitt's $400 back to him that night instead of Thursday, because she was not going to sleep with it in the house. And then it rained. The thaw came in on a warm front, and behind the warm front came rain. Not the polite kind. The kind that stands up straight and hammers. 2.5 inches in 19 hours. On ground that was still frozen a foot below the surface. Water couldn't sink. So it ran. It ran down the slope above the barn. Found the open cut she had hand-finished across 90 feet of hillside. And turned her trench into a sluice. Adelaide stood at the top of it at first light in the charcoal wool coat, with the collar up, braids soaked flat down her back, and looked at 2 months of work lying at the bottom of a ditch as mud soup. 90 feet of sidewall collapsed. The bedding sand she'd screened by hand, gone. Washed downslope into the pasture in a gray fan you could see from the road. The pipe run shifted out of true, and half filled with silt. 61 working days. Her hands were still cracked from the last of them. She knelt at the lip, put her palm flat on the earth, and it was cold. Just cold. Ordinary February cold. The warmth pulled straight out of it by all that running water, like heat out of an open door. She didn't say anything. She didn't kick anything. She walked the whole 90 feet, up and back, counting the failures. And then she went in and fed the stock. That was the day. That was the day it almost ended. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about the long, slow work. The failure does not come at you screaming. It comes at you as arithmetic. She sat at the kitchen table that night with the lamp on, and did the numbers on the back of a feed store receipt. And the number said $418. That's what was in the coffee can. $418, 22 bales of alfalfa, and a stack of soapstone she could not lift alone. 71 years old. No permit. No customers. No trench. No husband. 2 children on the other side of the country who thought she was out here being eccentric. And a card on the table. Ridley Marsh had left it on the porch rail 11 days earlier, waited under a river rock, so it wouldn't blow off. Because the man could not resist a gesture. Company decal on the front. And on the back, in that looping salesman's hand, a note he had written standing in her yard, with mud creeping up the welt of those shoes. He'd said it out loud, too, before he wrote it. Kindly. Dimples and all. Ma'am, I've watched 3 generations of Cobbs lose to this hollow. Your daddy died broke in a cold house dreaming about warm dirt. You're just the last one holding the shovel. Sign the financing. Let me put a proper unit in that barn. And you can stop, before the whole county has to watch you go under. 2 in the morning. The card face up on the oilcloth. 48-month financing. 380 gallons in the tank by Thursday. A sealed combustion unit hung and running in 11 days. Warm house. No trench. No stone. No cracked hands. No getting up 11 times a night at 71 years old to go read a rock in the dark. She had a pen in her fingers. She had already uncapped it. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea that nobody else believed in? Not a weekend of it. Not a season. Years. Years of being the joke at the feed store counter. Of eating the same beans. Of your own body wearing down, while the people who laugh sleep just fine. And then one morning the whole thing slides into a ditch. And there on your kitchen table is a man's business card, promising you that you can just stop. Have you ever been that tired? Where quitting doesn't feel like defeat. It just feels like sleep. She held the pen over the line for a long time. Long enough that the lamp oil got low, and the flame started to hunt. Then she set it down, and reached past the card, and picked up the green cloth field journal with a rubber band around it. She hadn't gone into the early volumes in months. The 1971 book was the thin one, the one with the water stain across the cover. She opened it because she wanted to see his handwriting. That's all. That was the entire reason. She was not looking for anything. And about a third of the way in, on a page she had somehow never studied, a hillside in cross-section. A trench. Gravel. A drain line. Her system. 56 years before she thought of it. And underneath, in his cramped, patient pencil, rain took the north cut. May 9th. 90-odd feet. Did not shore the walls. Did not crown the ground above. Water goes where you let it go. Adelaide's hand went to her mouth. The same hillside. The same 90 feet. The same rain. 56 years apart. And the earth had done the exact same thing to both of them, in the exact same place, for the exact same reason. She turned the page. And there were 3 more lines. AM 56, and have not the back for it twice. Will set it down for someone with more years than me. It is not a wrong idea. It is a wrong year. Adelaide Cobb put her head down on the kitchen table and wept. Not quietly. The way you weep when you are 71 years old and completely alone in a house, and there is nobody left to be dignified in front of. Because he had not been a crank with a warm dirt daydream. He had been a man who ran out of body before he ran out of answer. And he wrote the answer down. And he waited. Will set it down for someone with more years than me. He meant it. He actually meant it. He had failed, and understood precisely why he failed, and then sat down, and written the solution out in pencil for a person who did not exist yet. That is a kind of faith I do not have a word for. 56 years, that book sat in a crate under a workbench, waiting for somebody to come read it. She read the page 4 times. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve, which is not elegant, and I am not going to pretend that it was. And she looked at what he'd written about the fix. Shore the walls. Crown the ground above. Cut a diversion upslope. And then, at the bottom, in that flat, unimpressed voice, heat doesn't fight you. Water does. Give the water somewhere to go, and the heat will stay where you put it. Adelaide closed the journal, laid it square on the table beside Ridley Marsh's card, and picked up neither. She got up, and put her coat on, and went out to the barn at 2:30 in the morning in 22-degree air, with the wind coming down the hollow like it had somewhere to be. Lifted the latch. Stepped into that close, dark, breathing warm. And the stone in the last unit she had built, cold fire, 18 hours dead, was still reading 91 degrees. 91. 18 hours. The thing worked. The thing had always worked. She had just built it in the wrong ground, in the wrong season, with the wrong drainage, exactly one time. Which is not failure. Which is data. Bought and paid for with her own back. And with his. She stood in that barn until her feet went numb. Then she went inside and slept 9 hours for the first time since Sherwood died. And when she got up, she wrote 2 things on the slate board. The first was a supply list: washed river gravel, perforated drain tile, rigid foam board, black poly sheeting. The second was 4 words, in chalk, in the top right corner, where she would see them every morning for the next 7 years. It is not a wrong idea. And underneath, smaller, in her own hand, she added 1 line of her own. And I have got the years. By March the frost quit, and the ground let go, and Adelaide Cobb dug the whole line up again. 90 feet. Every foot of it hers. The same clay she had fought the year before. Except now she knew what the clay had done to her. Water. That was the whole answer. The pipe had bedded straight into the ground, and the ground had held the melt against it like a wet rag. And wet clay pulls heat out of a line faster than a chimney pulls smoke. 40% of her firebox output had gone into warming dirt and drainage that would never once thank her for it. So she rebuilt it mean. 12 inches of washed river gravel under the pipe. For more packed around it. A perforated drain tile running the whole length at the bottom of the trench, daylighting out the low side of the pasture, where the ground fell away toward the creek. Water hits gravel. Water leaves. Above the pipe, 2 inches of rigid foam board. Then a sheet of black poly, seams lapped a foot, and weighted with stone, so the melt on the surface ran off the shoulder instead of soaking down. And upslope of all of it, a diversion swale. Cut on the contour. Exactly where a man had drawn one in pencil in 1971, and never lived to build it. She hauled the gravel herself. 1 tractor bucket at a time. 31 loads. And she counted them out loud, every single one, because counting kept her from thinking about her back. 9 days. That's how long the rebuild took. 9 days, against 61 the first time. And if you want to know what experience is actually worth, that is the number. Now, about the permit. Because that was still sitting there. The stop work order, folded in a drawer. Quiet as a snake under a porch. And here is, where Adelaide Cobb did the thing nobody in that county expected. She did not fight it. She read it. All 11 pages of the amended county mechanical code at the kitchen table, with a pencil and a legal pad and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead more often than on her nose. 31 years a bookkeeper. You do not spend 31 years reconciling fuel receipts for a trucking company without learning that the rulebook is not your enemy. The rulebook is a map of where the doors are. And on page 7, she found one. Section 4. 2. Owner-occupied structures. Non-commercial. Exempt from listing requirement, subject to inspection. Her own barn. She could not install in somebody else's house. But nobody on God's earth could stop her from building it in her own. So build it. Build it so well that the code has to come to me. She wrote the section number on the slate board under the other line, and went back to work. That's the summer she stopped being alone. Not dramatically. Nobody threw her a parade. It started with a girl on a bicycle. Delcie Hale was 19 years old and lived 8 miles down the creek in a house her people heated with a wood stove that ate a quart a month and sent most of it straight up the chimney. She came up the lane in July of 2028 on a bicycle with a bad chain, because her mother had told her the Cobb woman was building something crazy, and Delcie Hale had a documented lifelong inability to leave a thing like that alone. She stood at the edge of the barn for 4 minutes, without saying anything. Adelaide let her stand. "That's a stove," Delcie finally said. Why's it got a rock coat?" And Adelaide Cobb straightened up from the bench, and something in her chest moved sideways. Because in 3 years, That was the first question anybody had asked her that wasn't rhetorical. "Come here," she said. She handed the girl a ball-peen hammer. "Tap that plate." Tink. "Now that one." Thud. Delcie's face changed. "Do it again." Tink. Thud. Tink. "That's cracked," Delcie said. "That second one's cracked." "That's right." "How much of this is cracked?" "All of it." The girl looked at 40 tons of ruined iron stacked to the rafters. "So what good is it?" And Adelaide said, "Cracked iron still weighs the same." Delcie Hale came back the next day, and the day after that, and she never really stopped. Winter 3. And here is where I want you to pay attention, because this is the part the Hollow could not argue with. Dawn. Mid-December, 2027. 13 degrees. Every roof in that hollow white with frost. The Kessler place. The 2 rentals on the county road. The church shed. All of them furred over like something dead. And on the Cobb barn steam. Rising off the tin in slow ropes. Gold where the sun caught it. Because the loop line ran under, that roof line, and the mass in, that building never dropped below 50. You could see it, from the ridge road 2 miles off. People slowed down for it. A man named Kessler pulled over on the shoulder in his truck at 6:40 in the morning, with his coffee going cold in the cup holder. And he sat there 11 minutes, looking at a barn roof. Inside the house, 70 degrees. 70. Flat. Held from November to March. She marked it twice a day, and wrote it in the green cloth journal, under her father's last entries. Her hand next to his hand. 0 cords of purchased firewood. 0 gallons of propane. 0. 3 years before, the propane bill on that house had run $2,340 for the season. Now the number was 0. And Ridley Marsh's contract was a piece of paper in a drawer, with no signature on it. Here's what fed the thing. 40 tons of biomass a year. And not 1 pound of it bought. Sawmill slabwood from the Doyle brothers' yard, they were paying a hauler $75 a load to take it off, so they let her have it free, and thanked her for the trouble. Orchard prunings. Stormfall. Pallet stock off the co-op dock. She ran it through the firebox in what she'd learned to call units. A unit being 1 packed armload. Roughly 19 pounds of dry mixed hardwood. Over a season, she'd burned 1,200 of them. 1,200 units. 40 tons. All of it waste. Every scrap of it material that somebody else was paying money to make disappear. And the efficiency, that's the number she was proudest of, and it took her 3 winters to earn it. 62% recovery. Meaning 62 cents out of every dollar of heat in, that would ended up in the water loop instead of going up the flue. She measured it the crude, honest way. Inlet and outlet temperatures. A flow meter off a scrapped irrigation pump. Arithmetic done at the kitchen table, with a pencil. A conventional stove in a drafty farmhouse runs maybe 35. Marsh's forced air propane setup, once you counted duct loss, wasn't doing a whole lot better. 62. On slabwood. For free. The talk changed that winter. Not into praise. This is Appalachia. Nobody is handing out praise. But the laughing stopped. February, she came into the feed store for mineral blocks, with her braid down her back, and her cheekbones red from the cold. And the counter went quiet. The particular way a room goes quiet, when 3 men have just been discussing you, and got caught at it. Cadet Lowry nodded at her. Nobody made the joke about the old woman boiling water for a living. Nobody said a word about Ephraim. Grudging silence. That is a currency out here. It is worth more than applause. Then the cold snap came the 2nd week of February. 9 below. 3 nights running. wind pushing straight down the hollow. And Verna Teague's dairy barn, a good barn, a working barn, 41 head of Holsteins, lost its water. The pipes to the milking parlor froze solid in the wall cavity, then split, then dumped 80 gallons across the concrete before she got the main shut off. Her propane wall unit ran the entire night and couldn't hold that room above 34. Marsh's office told her the service truck was 3 days out and reminded her, politely, that her account balance was past due. At 7:40 the next morning, boots crunching first on the walk, Verna Teague came up onto the Cobb porch in her brown insulated coveralls. She had already taken the red knit cap off. She was holding it in both hands. She knocked. Now, Adelaide Cobb had a right to a great many things in that moment. She had a right to let the woman stand out there a while. She had a right to say $89 a month in a certain tone of voice. She had a right to say took to it like a duck, which is what she had heard, from 4 feet away, with a box of stove bolts in her hand, and had never once repeated to a living soul. She opened the door. "Verna! Adelaide! Come in out of it!" That's all. That is the entire scene. 4 words. And if you have ever in your life been owed an apology that you knew you were never going to get, you understand exactly how much those 4 words cost. Verna sat at the kitchen table in a 70-degree room in her coveralls and started sweating within 4 minutes and did not comment on it. Her milk house froze every January. Her propane bill for that one small building, 1 water heater, 1 bulk tank, 1 line she could not let ice, ran $1,100 a winter. She wanted to know if the thing Adelaide had built in her own barn could be made smaller. Adelaide did not gloat. She got a pencil. But there was the permit. And she said so straight out. Because Adelaide Cobb was not going to start this by hiding a thing in a drawer. "I can't install in your building, Verna." "Why not?" "County says it isn't a legal appliance. It's heating your house right this minute." "It's heating my house. That's the loophole. And I'm not going into anybody's building until there's a stamp on this." Verna sat back. "Then what am I doing here?" And Adelaide said, "You're going to help me change the code." Which brings us to the hearing. And to a man from the university who arrived in November of 2028 in a little sedan with state plates that bottomed out on the culvert and left a piece of trim in the gravel. His name was Aldous Pike. He had instruments and aluminum cases and no idea whatsoever what he was walking into. He'd heard a claim secondhand and assumed it was farm exaggeration, and he had the specific expression of a man doing a favor for a colleague. He put a flue gas analyzer on the main barn core and a data logger on the loop line. Left them running 11 days. Adelaide went about her work. Fed the stock. Split wood. Pike's numbers, when he finally sat at her kitchen table with them. 71% net thermal efficiency. On a system built entirely out of junk. Moving usable heat 240 feet underground, with a soil loss factor under 9%. Stack temperature at the cap, 140 degrees. He read it twice. Then he looked up at her. "Mrs. Cobb, who designed this?" She slid the green cloth journal across the table. Rubber band still around it. He opened it, and did not speak for a very long time. And when he finally did, his voice had changed. "When did he do this work?" 68 through 77. That's... He stopped. Turned a page. Turned it back. "Ma'am, this predates most of the published literature." He didn't publish. "Why not?" And Adelaide Cobb said, "Nobody asked him." The hearing was set for the 14th of March, 2029. County Building and Codes. A folding table. 6 chairs. A room that smelled like carpet glue and burnt coffee. Adelaide brought 3 things. A 3-ring binder of 1100 temperature readings, chalked off a slate board, and copied out in a bookkeeper's hand. Dr. Aldous Pike in a tie. And the journals. All 11. In a crate. Verna Teague came too, and sat in the back, with her arms crossed, and the red cap in her fist. And when the chairman asked who she was representing, she said, "Myself," in a voice that ended the question. Delcie Hale sat next to her, with a notebook. And Ridley Marsh sat in the second row. Because of course he did. He had a right to be there. He was a licensed installer in that county, and it was a public hearing, and he had every legal right in the world. He wore the navy quilted vest. He did not have the clipboard. It went badly for 90 minutes. Not hostile. Worse. Procedural. The chairman was a decent man named Sutherland, who kept saying, "I don't disagree with you, ma'am. That's not the issue. The issue was listing. The issue was liability. The issue was that no laboratory in the United States had put a sticker on a stove made of 130-year-old cracked castings wrapped in soapstone by a 74-year-old woman in a barn." Pike testified. It helped some. The binder helped more. But you could feel the room settling toward no, the way weather settles. And Adelaide sat there, with her hands flat on the table, and understood that she was about to lose. Say something. Say what? They're not wrong. That is the whole trouble. They are not wrong, and Marsh wasn't wrong either, and you cannot argue a man out of being right. Except. And then she remembered a thing she had read on page 4 of the 1971 journal, and had skimmed straight past. Twice. Because it was boring. She raised her hand. "Mr. Sutherland, has this board reviewed an application like this before?" "Not in my time, ma'am." "How far back does your time go?" 89. Adelaide said. "Then I would ask you to pull the file from 1971. They took a recess. It lasted 40 minutes. And when the clerk came back, she was walking faster than she'd left, and she had a folder that had not been opened since the Nixon administration. She put it down in front of the chairman without a word. Application for variance, masonry heating appliance, E.T. Cobb, January 1971. Denied. Denied in 6 weeks, with a 2-line finding. Appliance not of recognized type. Applicant not qualified. And a signature. And under the signature, because this was 1971, and men were not careful then about the shape of a thing, the disclosure line that the county required of every sitting board member. Business interest, bulk fuel distribution, regional. Brother-in-law, principal. The room went absolutely silent. Chairman Sutherland read it 3 times. Then he took his glasses off. Her father had not been a crank. Her father had filed. He had gone into a room in a clean shirt, with his own drawings, and asked permission, and a man with a financial interest in Propane signed a piece of paper that said not qualified. And then Ephraim Cobb had gone home to a hollow that laughed at him for 23 more years, and never once told anybody that he had tried. Not his neighbors. Not his daughter. He just put it in a drawer, and went on being the joke. Adelaide sat in that folding chair, and thought about a man in a chair by a north window, with a cold cup of coffee at his elbow. And she did not cry. Not there. She said very quietly, "I'd like that read into the record." The variance passed 11 days later. 4-1. Conditional. Subject to inspection. Subject to a burn test that ran 11 hours with 3 thermocouples in the core. It took 4 more years and 2 structural engineers before the language got amended properly and the Cobb mass core became a permitted residential design in that county. She was 78 when the stamp finally came. She framed it. Now here is the part one need to tell you carefully, because there is a version of this story where Ridley Marsh gets what is coming to him. And that version would feel wonderful for about 9 seconds. And then it would be worth nothing at all. That is not what happened. He came up the lane in December of 2031. No clipboard. Ox blood shoes, ruined again in the same mud he had never once learned to expect. Adelaide was in the shop. 3 farmers waiting. A stack of reline cores. Verna Teague planted by the bench, with her arms crossed. Pike's second set of loggers still ticking on the wall. Marsh stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. "Mrs. Cobb." "Mr. Marsh." "You've got a business." "I've got a waiting list." He nodded slowly. "I lost the route," he said. Adelaide set down her rule. "Not to you," he said quickly. "Company consolidated. 3 counties into 1 territory, run out of hazard." They kept the younger fella. "How long were you with them?" 26 years. Nobody in that shop moved. Here is what he did not say, and what Adelaide found out later from Verna, who found it out from the milk truck. His mother was 88 years old. She lived in a rented place on the Middlesbrough Road with a wall furnace and a 200-gallon tank. And Ridley Marsh, who had sold propane in that county for 26 years, who had personally set a tank in the yard of half the houses on that road, could not afford to fill his own mother's. He hadn't come to gloat. He hadn't come to sell. He had come because he had run out of other doors. And he could not make his mouth form the request. So Adelaide asked it for him. "How cold does she keep it?" Marsh's jaw worked. 56, he said. The whole shop heard it. 26 years of set it, and forget it. And you don't have to be special out here. And pride doesn't heat a house. And his own mother was sleeping in 56 degrees. Verna Teague made a sound in her throat. And Adelaide turned her head about 4 inches and looked at her. And Verna stopped. "Delcie." "Ma'am." "Get the C-grade plate off the north wall. The one with the good flange." Delcie went. Marsh said, "I didn't come here to—" "I know it. I reported you to the county." "You did. I cost you a customer. You cost me 4. He looked at the floor. "Then why?" he said. And this is the only speech Adelaide Cobb ever gave in her life, and it was 4 sentences long. "Because your mother is cold," she said. "And she didn't do anything to me." She wiped her hands on the rag. "And because a man came to my father in 1971 with a form and a pen and a kind voice and told him his idea was worth nothing. And my father believed him for 23 years. She hung the rag on the nail. "I'm not doing that to anybody." She built it in 9 days. She charged him for the firebrick. $218. He stood there in the doorway, with his checkbook out, in those ruined shoes, and said, "Labor." "I'll need a receipt for the brick," Adelaide said. That's the price, mister." "Marsh." He wrote the check. Then he put his hand out, and Adelaide shook it. He said something about the weather. Nobody in the room picked it up. Then he walked back to his car, and the smoke coming off that barn roof was so clean you could not see it. And the gravel did not have the decency to be dramatic about it. It just crunched. He never said sorry. He was not built to. But every February for 11 years after that, a man in a navy quilted vest showed up at the end of that lane with a truck bed full of scrap cast iron he had collected off his old route. Free. Dumped it. Waved. Left. Word moves through a dairy county faster than any advertisement. Because it moves through the milk truck. The driver told a man in Sandy Hook. The man in Sandy Hook told his brother-in-law. By the following October, Adelaide had built 6 systems. By the spring, after that, 19, spread across 2 counties. And a waiting list written in pencil on the back page of her own field book. She charged modestly, brick and iron, and $40 a day for her hands, which was less than a plumber, and worth 10 times more. She never advertised. Not once. Not a sign. Not a flyer. Not a booth at the county fair. Have you ever noticed how the people who mock you loudest go quietest first? Not one of them ever said a word about it. They just started showing up at the end of her lane, with a truck bed full of scrap iron and a question. She built 94 of them with her own hands. 94. Between the ages of 72 and 79. And I want that number to sit with you for 1 second. Because there is a story this country tells about what a woman is for after 70. And that story is rest. That story is a card on a porch rail and $89 a month, and you don't have to be special out here. 94. The last one she built alone was in June of 2034, and it took her 19 days instead of 9. And she wrote both numbers in the journal without comment, because a bookkeeper does not editorialize. She records. Verna Teague died in the spring of 2034. 9 years of friendship. That's what they got. Starting at 68 and 73 respectively, which is late by any measure, and which turns out to be exactly as good as friendship that starts at 19. A thing nobody tells you. And which is true anyway. Her son runs the dairy now. And the milk parlor is still heated by the second unit Adelaide ever built. Rebuilt twice. Relined once. Still throwing 80 degrees at the stalls on a 9-degree morning. He came up the hill that fall with a question about flue temperature, and no condescension anywhere in his face. Which is exactly how his mother came up that hill the first time. Red knit cap in her hand. Nobody out here ever says sorry. They just show up, with their hat off, and a real question. And that is the apology. And it is better than words, because it costs more. There is a woman in the shop this morning. 25 years old. Sleeves shoved to the elbow. Kneeling at the firebox opening of a half-built core, with a strip of white muslin pinched between 2 fingers. "Hold it lower," Adelaide says. She's sitting on the bench, with her hands on her knees. 79 years old. Silver hair pulled back in the same thick single braid. The brass case stove thermometer hangs at her collarbone. The boot lace has been replaced twice. The case is worn down to a soft gold, where 60-some years of thumbs, her father's first, then hers, have rubbed the numbers half away. Delcie drops the strip 2 inches. It hangs slack. Then leans. Then bends inward, and holds there, steady as a needle. "That's your draft," Adelaide says. "Not the smoke. Smoke lies to you. Cloth doesn't. How much do I want? You want it to lean, and stay leaning. If it flutters, your throat's too tight. If it goes dead, your bypass is open somewhere it shouldn't be." She gets up. Crosses over. Taps the brick with 2 knuckles. "Take a reading at the top of the second pass in 20 minutes. If it's under 300, you built the channel too long, and you'll get creosote in the horizontal run by February." Delcie writes it down. She has her own notebook now, and the handwriting in it is starting to slant the same direction. Adelaide goes to the workbench and takes down the green cloth field journal. The rubber band around it has been replaced maybe 30 times. This one is brown and stretched. The cloth cover is soft as an old shirt. Inside, the first 40 pages are a dead man's pencil, and the rest is hers. And the last 11 pages are blank. On purpose. She sets it in Delcie's hands. Then she lifts the thermometer off over her head, the bootlace still warm, and puts that on top of it. "That's the whole thing," she says. "Every failure I paid for, so you don't have to. The plate that split. The stove that smoked back at me for 2 winters. The trench. It's all in there. And half of it's wrong. And you'll find out which half." Delcie holds it like it might come apart in her hands. Then she opens it, because she cannot help herself. And Adelaide reaches over and turns to a page near the front. 1971, the thin volume. The one with the water stain. Down in the margin, in pencil so faint you have to angle it toward the window. Something Ephraim Cobb wrote in the spring of 1978. The year his daughter left this hollow, and told him, standing in the yard, with her bag already in the car, that he had wasted his entire life on drawings that nobody would ever build. Addie says I wasted it. Maybe she is right. But if she ever comes back, it is all here. And she will not have to start from nothing. Delcie Hale looks up. "He wrote that before. 56 years before. But he didn't know you'd ever." "No," Adelaide says. "He didn't know anything." She takes her glasses off, folds them. "He just left it, where I could find it." Delcie says nothing for a long moment. Then, why didn't he ever tell anybody? About the hearing. About being turned down. And Adelaide looks out the window at the ridge, and the snow coming down past it. "Because he thought the answer mattered more than who got credit for it," she says. "He used to tell me that waste is just a failure of imagination. I was 13. I thought he was talking about firewood." She stands up. "He wasn't." Outside, the snow keeps coming down the hollow. And past the bend, if you know what to look for, you can count them. 9 roofs steaming in that same slow ribbon. No propane trucks on the road. 2 pieces of paper hang framed on the workshop wall, side by side. Same cheap black frames. Same dusty glass. The one on the left is the county certification. The building inspector stamp. Cobb Mass Corps. Approved for residential installation under the amended code. 4 years. 2 structural engineers. An 11-hour burn test. The one on the right is a propane disconnection notice. Yellow carbon copy. Account terminated. Service line capped at the meter. Fee for removal, $75. 00, paid in cash. She hung them at exactly the same height. On purpose. Anybody who asks gets a look, and nothing else. 22 years later, Delcie Hale is 47 years old, and standing in that same shop. There's a photograph on the wall beside the 2 frames. A woman in a charcoal wool coat standing in front of a pile of broken iron in 2025, refusing to smile at the camera. The last count anybody bothered to make was 312. 312 of them out there in the dark hills, breathing warm. Across Kentucky, West Virginia, the Virginia side of the line, a scattering down into Tennessee. Every one built off the same 11 pages of pencil drawings. Nobody calls them eccentric anymore. The word people use now is standard. There is a woman at the shop door this morning. 60-something. Coat too thin for the weather. A folded piece of paper in her hand that Delcie recognizes from across the room because it is always the same paper. A fuel bill. And she has that look. The one that says she already decided she is too old for whatever comes next, and she drove up here anyway. Delcie Hale wipes her hands on a rag. Reaches up to her own collarbone, where a brass case stove thermometer hangs on a bootlace, the numbers rubbed half away by 3 generations of thumbs. And she says what Adelaide Cobb said to her in that same doorway, and what Adelaide said to Verna Teague on a February porch, and what a man in 1971 never once got said to him by anybody at all. "Coming out of it. Here is what this story is actually about. It is about a woman who came home at 69 with a dead husband, $6,800, and the belief that her useful years were behind her, and who turned out to be wrong by 94. It is about a man who was told his idea was worth nothing by somebody with a form and a pen, and who believed it for 23 years, and who kept writing anyway. For a reader who did not exist yet, it is about the fact that the cruelest words are rarely shouted. They are usually said kindly, by somebody who thinks he is helping. You don't have to be special out here. Somebody says a version of that to somebody else every single day in this country. Be careful it isn't you. And it is about 40 tons of cracked iron, which was garbage right up until one person looked at it and asked a different question. Waste is just a failure of imagination. He wasn't talking about firewood. He was talking about people, the ones we write off, because they are too old, too poor, too odd, or too late. The scrapyard is full of things that only needed somebody to see them correctly. So if you are sitting there tonight doing the arithmetic on your own life, and the numbers look like they've already been settled, check them again. Cracked iron still weighs the same.